Good evening, everyone. I'm Alicia Sams, Director of the Fellows Program here at the IOP, and I am delighted to welcome you to this extraordinary and timely panel to discuss North Korea and its threat to the US and our allies. This program is part of the university's Nuclear Reaction Series, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the first controlled, self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. More information on this program can be found at nuclearreactions.chicago.edu. As usual, we will open up the floor to take questions from the audience partway through the program. There will be a microphone on each aisle, so when the time comes, please line up behind either one of those microphones. We'll give priority for the first 3 questions to our students, and please remember that a question ends in a question mark. And just if you could take time to make sure your phones are on silent before we begin the program. Here to formally introduce our speakers is Zach Worley. Zach is a 4th-year student from Salem, Oregon, majoring in political science and Germanic studies. This year, he is chair of the IOP's International Policy Program for our speaker series, and he was an intern at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs this summer. Please join me in welcoming Zach to the podium.
Thank you, Alicia, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here with you all this evening and honored to have the opportunity to introduce our esteemed panelists. This year, we've seen an unprecedented escalation in the tensions between North Korea, the United States, and our regional allies. From inflammatory rhetoric to threats to missile tests, the possibility of all-out war with North Korea feels more real than ever before. But what is North Korea really capable of? Will it be possible for the United States, Japan, and South Korea to pursue a diplomatic solution to the issue, effectively curbing North Korea's nuclear program? Or will the United States be forced to resort to military action, risking nuclear war with a dangerous adversary? And what will China's role be in all of this? I'm confident that our panelists here tonight will be able to shed light on this issue and so many more. Our first guest will be David E. Sanger, the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. David has dedicated more than 30 years to covering foreign policy. He specializes in nuclear proliferation and has been awarded numerous honors for his work on national security coverage. Next, we have Ambassador Mark Lippert, who is the US Ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. Ambassador Lippert brings with him extensive diplomatic and military experience, including earning a Bronze Star for his service in Iraq. Serving as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs, and as Chief of Staff for Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. And last, but most certainly not least, we have Dr. Han Sung-ju, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Korea. Dr. Han also served as Korean Ambassador to the United States and is in Chicago as the 2017 Marshall Baton Fellow with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The panel will be moderated by Emma Belcher, Director of Nuclear Challenges at the MacArthur Foundation. Prior to her tenure at the MacArthur Foundation, Ms. Belcher served as the Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in a round of applause for our panelists, Ambassador Mark Lippert, David Sanger, Dr. Han, and Dr. Emma Belcher.
I never know if you should clap for yourself or not.
Thanks very much, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and sharing the stage with these esteemed panelists. This is certainly a very timely topic, as tensions are high in on the Korean Peninsula. And the issue of North Korea and its nuclear program has really captured public attention much more in the last sort of 6 to 9 months than it really has even a year ago. It's also very timely because President Trump is in the middle of his Asia tour, having been recently in Japan meeting with Prime Minister Abe, meeting recently with President Moon in South Korea, and he is about to address the National Assembly in Seoul. And then he's off to China to meet with President Xi. So certainly the organisers of the panel have sort of had great foresight about the timing of this event. And they've also put together a very distinguished panel of people with a range of backgrounds and experiences they can bring to our discussion, as you heard by their bios. So before I launch into questions, I thought I'd just set the scene a little bit, a little more building on from what Zach has already told us about the situation. And put out there what we think we know about the North Korean program for now. And I'm hoping that the panelists will also jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but add greater detail and nuance as we talk throughout the night. So really, North Korea has been sort of pursuing this weapons program for a number of decades, and there's been a lot of diplomacy over that time to try and rein it in. But really, there are sort of current estimates of about how many nuclear weapons the North might have range. Some as few as maybe 10 weapons, and others up to as many as maybe 60. But, you know, possibly between 20 to 30 or so is sort of, I think, the general range that a lot of experts and observers think. And the North has really conducted a number of tests, 2006, again in 2009, 2013, 2 again in 2016, and then this year, the biggest test yet on September 3. So that's the sort of the nuclear component of it. But we also know that they've been developing their delivery systems, the missiles, that they would put the weapons atop in order to reach various parts of the world. And the missile testing has really greatly accelerated, definitely since Kim Jong-un took over in 2011. We know that even sort of from this year, from February of this year, I believe there have been around 20 missiles tested in 15 tests. So this has really sort of ramped up recently, culminating, I guess, in tests of sorry, let's try again. It's like that nuclear word, isn't it? Intercontinental ballistic missiles in July of this year. And really why that's sort of become something that people have been very concerned about is that potentially has the ability to reach continental United States. So there is debate as well about, you know, what they have achieved so far, and, you know, whether or not they've miniaturized a weapon that they could put on top of one of these missiles is another question. And it appears most observers think that they probably haven't yet perfected the technology whereby the missile, as it re-enters the Earth's atmosphere, whereby the nuclear weapon on top of it would not burn out. So it seems as though they're a step away from perfecting all of the technology to really threaten the United States. And there's debate over when that might be the case, but regardless of all of that, North Korea has greatly increased its capabilities, and we're getting closer and closer to a point at which I guess we all hear fear. So what I want to do, you know, we've seen sort of in this time increasing tension internationally, and we've seen a range of sort of rhetoric back and forth, and tensions have become quite high in a way that we haven't seen before during various points of crisis with respect to North Korea. So what I want to do actually is ask the panelists, how serious is the threat today? And I think I'd like to start with David Sanger and say, David, you've been working on this for decades, since the early 90s. My first question for you is actually, did you anticipate working on this issue still and reporting on it still over a quarter of a century later? But that's a bit flippant. My real question for you is, based on the decades of diplomacy that you've seen and the different points of crisis, how do you rate this point of crisis, and how did we get here?
Well, we're at a pretty high point of crisis, and we're at a high point because of the merger of those two technologies that you described. It's been 11 years since North Korea first tested a nuclear weapon, but their first tests weren't terribly impressive. The first one kind of fizzled. Second and third were pretty low yield. But they've been on the curve that many countries were on. And by the time you do this for the fourth or fifth time, you kind of get the hang of it. Then the question was, could they develop a missile that could reach us, which has been their goal really since Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, determined that they really needed nuclear weapons to protect Korea from what he remembered well, which was the threat that MacArthur would use nuclear weapons to end the Korean War in 1950, 51, 52, before MacArthur was fired. So President Trump was unlucky enough to be the one sitting in the seat at the moment that these two technologies came to converge. That we got to the point where we think the North Koreans can shrink a nuclear weapon small enough to fit at atop a warhead that can reach the United States. They've long been able to shrink one to put on a medium or short-range missile that could hit Seoul, which is, of course, only 35 miles from the DMZ, or to hit Tokyo. So to some degree, we're focused on this now only because they can hit us. They have long been able to hit our allies. A last point on this. There's been a lot of good diplomacy that has been done on North Korea over the years that bought us some time, but they never bought us a solution. And the reason is that every American president who has looked at a big incremental advance that the North Koreans made, whether it was getting plutonium out of their reactor at Yongbyon, or deciding to leave the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or whether it was their first big missile advances, or their nuclear tests, every president has looked at each individual incident and said, this is a significant advance, but it's not worth risking losing Seoul or the general war that could follow in order to stop them at this particular point. And if you look at any one of those decisions in isolation, I think they made perfect sense. If you add them up over a quarter century, what you get is what we have today, a fully formed nuclear power that is approaching the capabilities that Pakistan had, but would be Pakistan with additional reach. And that's the dilemma. And it's an interesting lesson and study in nuclear politics, because you can make good, conservative, sober judgments along the way and still lose control of the program.
Great. Thanks very much. And Ambassador Lippert, you have recently served as ambassador to Seoul. From your perspective and your time in the region, but also previous experience monitoring, what's your assessment of where we are today, as well as what are the sort of other regional players' role in this, and what's China's role in all of this?
Thanks for the question. Great to be here. It was not mentioned in my biography, but I did survive 1 year at the University of Chicago as a first-year student. I also played baseball here on the glorious 5-30 campaign of 1992. Go Maroons. What I would say on a couple of things. Where are we now? Look, the program, the nuclear missile program in North Korea is big, it's dangerous, it's accelerating. I think everybody will stipulate to that. Second, what I would say is the real difference here is Kim Jong-un. And to David's point a little bit about some of the earlier episodes over the past 25 years, Kim Jong-un is not his father. His father would negotiate. And I think, Bill Clinton came pretty darn close to a deal, and had Al Gore won the election, had Bill Clinton gone to Pyongyang, maybe at the end of his term, vice the Middle East issue flaring up and/or the Supreme Court issue, it may be a different outcome today. President Obama also tried very hard with Kim Jong-un's father to get a deal. And there was a deal reached early in the Obama administration called the Leap Day deal. But along the way, we now know that Kim Jong-un's father was incapacitated. And you talk to our negotiators who went up there during that time, and they said something felt different. Something changed. They weren't able to get the traction that they otherwise would have been able to get. So there have been interesting efforts at diplomacy, and I would give the Bush administration credit for the 2005 joint statement as well. So there were three, I think, very serious attempts at diplomacy along the way, failed for various reasons. But I think recently, the big difference in all of this is Kim Jong-un doesn't want to negotiate, much more black and white than his father, hasn't left the country, and the program has accelerated despite the political costs. Final point I would say, when you look at the program now, I think you have to look at it less as a political instrument, where you could, I think, argue that was the intent of his father, maybe to keep a little program, trade away some, buy himself some diplomatic space, And at least right now, you have to look at it as a full-blown military program in terms of its testing, its technical expertise, the intentions behind it. And what I'll say is, I think we just don't know where he's headed. You could argue that, on the one hand, he's been pretty smart. He has sensed weakness in the international community and just driven the program to be as big as he possibly can. And unless and until the international community congeals, he'll probably keep doing that. The other thing that's interesting is the counter-argument where he probably could be about as far along as he is today, but had the international community much more divided. And why do I say that? He turned down a trip in 2015 to Russia to go see Vladimir Putin. Had he taken that trip and had he pulled it off, that would have created a little division between Beijing and Russia on North Korea that his grandfather played off beautifully, right? He did not pursue the abductee issue with Tokyo, which is a big issue for Prime Minister Abe and would have, again, caused tension in the other 5 parties that are unified against him today. Turned down inter-Korean talks, both under Park Geun-hye and now Moon Jae-in. And again, the point here is there were multiple opportunities to exploit rifts in this system. So I think the jury is still out about what kind of leader he is, where he's heading, and will he ultimately negotiate, which I think is really kind of the pressing question that we're dealing with today, and I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Dr. Han, heading to you. You've been involved in this issue for a long time, including you were foreign minister at the time of the 1994 agreed framework. I'm wondering, I'd love your comments on the current situation, but if also you can talk about what was the crisis in 1994, what were the options then, and how did you get to the agreement? And are there similarities or differences between the situation now and then from which to draw lessons?
Well, let me start by responding to your first question about the danger of the North Korean nuclear issue today. From the Korean point of view, nuclear weapons and missiles per se do not represent any quantum jump in the level of threat, because we've been subject to North Korean attack by nuclear weapons and missiles for several years now. Now, because North Korea has probably completed or in the process of completing ICBMs and larger bombs like thermonuclear bombs, it creates other kind of danger for us, and that is the response that other countries, the United States, Japan, China, might have regarding the issue. So from the South Korean point of view, the threat is both from the nuclear weapons themselves and the danger of military conflict that will bring about as a result of their development. So coming back to your question, back in 1993 and 4, we had basically the same considerations. That is, North Korea having nuclear weapons will change the military balance within the Korean Peninsula, and the kind of proliferation that will bring about in the area, and the reaction of other countries that will, in the course of dealing with the nuclear issue. And the difference then and now is that North Korea was at the incipient period of developing nuclear weapons. And at that time, back in 1992 and 93, our main interest was in first stopping their nuclear program, but also probing what they did in the past. And so thinking back about it, I think we were trying to probe the past at the cost of, at that time, not really stopping, but almost sacrificing the ongoing monitoring, ongoing inspection system of the nuclear weapons. And I think we could have handled it somewhat differently. First, we had to maintain the system of inspection, system of monitoring, and keeping them from engaging in nuclear activities before trying to probe what they had done before. Now, 10 years later, in 2002, what we did was, in the interest of preventing what North Korea will do with enriched uranium in the future, we sacrificed the ongoing inspection system. So it was a real irony, because in trying to first probe the past and then next to prevent further North Korean nuclear activities, we sort of handled the maintenance of the inspection system in a different way. So that is one probably lesson that we have to learn from what we had done before. I'm not criticizing what we have done, but that is the kind of situation that we have to think about.
Great. Thank you. The next question, I wanted to ask a little bit about the people involved. And Ambassador Lippert, you introduced this brilliantly. We didn't confer about this beforehand. But you mentioned you're thinking about who Kim Jong-un is, and he is not like his father. I have a question I get, and I think this is open for any of the panelists, but there is often not much known about North Korea publicly, and it seems like a bit of a black box. And there seems to be a tendency to portray Kim Jong-un as an irrational madman. As countries are thinking about how to deal with each other and thinking about moving into dialogue and negotiations, is that the most useful way to think about things? Or how would you enter, I'll put it in a different way. Given the people involved, what are the prospects for diplomacy? And how would you enter into discussions or negotiations with the players who are involved right now? Anybody?
I was going to sit this one out, but I'll get into it. I had two small kids at home, so I never get any sleep, so I was going to take a breather. Anyway, I guess what I would say is this. At least when I served in government, the assessment was he's rational, he's in control of the country. I think there's a question out there about what his intentions are and how much he understands and or quite frankly cares about international diplomacy. And I think partly to his detriment, I do think he could probably have the international community more divided against him than otherwise would be the case. But I would also say that the data, at least at this point, show that he just is not interested in negotiating. The Obama administration tried and tried and tried with him multiple times through what we call the New York Channel. We had, as I said earlier, we had a deal, the Leap Day deal, that literally blew apart 3 weeks later, thereabouts. And was capped after a year of trying to resuscitate it with another nuclear test. So you also look at, as I mentioned earlier, he rejected both Park Geun-hye and Moon Jae-in in terms of inter-Korean talks that I think could have been fruitful. He did not follow through with the Japanese on the abduction issue. And again, turned down a trip to Moscow and really has had the worst relationship in a long, long time. I won't sort of put the periodicity on it with his treaty ally, the Chinese. So, you know, it all points in one direction, at least at this point. And, you know, when they do make noises about talking through Track 2 or public statements or elsewhere, it's, we want a peace treaty. We want to be recognized as a nuclear weapons power. We want U.S. exercises to stop. And I suspect with the Chinese, we want resources. And with the exception of resources, the first three are, you know, well-worn negotiating avenues that the North Koreans know pose problems for the international community and aren't really the basis for talks. Last thing I'll say is, the thing that's interesting though, in 2015, when there was an artillery exchange, or there was shooting at the demilitarized zone. People may or may not remember that. The North Koreans showed up. They were ready to negotiate with the South Koreans. Negotiations lasted about 3 days. They were professional, they were quick, they were succinct. They had instructions to negotiate, they negotiated, and they got a deal. And that was clearly because there was political will, political intention at the top. And the point here I'll leave you with is that when there is political will, there is the capability to get to a deal. And so I think with the Obama administration on the way out the door, and to some extent the Trump administration, have been trying to run a pressure strategy aimed at changing Kim Jong-un's calculation through sanctions and through military buildup to get that calculation more favorable towards coming back to the table.
Yeah, take a stab at this, Emma. Try to ask all of you to put yourselves in the position of Kim Jong-un today. And I think when you do, you can certainly make a case that everything he's doing is perfectly rational. Start with this. He looks at the example, and North Koreans have written and commented on this, of what happened in the case of Libya with Muammar al-Gaddafi. Okay? So you may recall that when Gaddafi in 2003, right after the invasion of Iraq, turned over a very nascent nuclear weapons program to the IAEA and to the United States. This program was an equipment that was still in its boxes. I went down to the laboratory in Tennessee to go see it, and the US had badly blacked out the words Khan Research Laboratory, Islamabad, you know, from the side. So we knew where he had gotten a lot of this equipment. He turned it over, and the concept was that Libya would gradually be reintegrated in return for this with the Western economies. Essentially the same deal that we would be making with the North Koreans. And for a while that worked. American leaders went. Condoleezza Rice went as Secretary of State. Tony Blair went. They all visited Gaddafi in his tent. They all talked about plans to go do the reintegration. Not much happened, partly because Gaddafi didn't know how to go do it. And then Gaddafi's people turned against him. The Europeans, the Arab states, and the United States came in and bombed Gaddafi as he was headed toward Benghazi. He went on the run. He ended up in a ditch. He got pulled out of the ditch by Libyan rebels, shot, and his body paraded around. That made a real impression on the North Koreans. And the conclusion they came to it was, what was Gaddafi's mistake? His mistake was he didn't finish that nuclear weapons program. In fact, he barely got it going. And the reasonable conclusion I think they've come to is, we're not going to make the same mistake. And so if you're wondering why it is that Kim Jong-un is not negotiating, I think part of the answer is he wants to demonstrate that he's finished all the major elements of his program, and he's pretty close. Yeah. And so if you're looking at the world the way he looks at it, it may make sense. And then he looks at a president now who is walking backward, hasn't completely scrapped, but walking backward from a nuclear agreement that his predecessor had negotiated with Iran. We'll separate out for a minute the details and whether or not you think the Iran deal was a good deal or a bad deal or didn't last long enough. I covered it for several years. I can give you my list of critiques as well. But if you're Kim Jong-un, you're thinking to yourself, why would I enter into a deal with a country where one president signs up to it and the next president says, forget about it. So it's possible that he's very rational. Last point on this. As Mark suggested, it's not at all clear that his end game is the same end game that his father and his grandfather had. I think it's fair to say, and I'd be interested to hear particularly Dr. Hahn on this issue, that his predecessors were interested mostly in regime survival. He's interested in regime survival, but he may see the opportunity with this weapon, as Mark suggested before, to use it for blackmail, to use it for some additional deal. There are some who believe that he thinks that while South Korea's got all the money and the technology, they don't have the essence of the Korean state anymore, and that he can forcibly reunify the country. We don't know, but once he gets a full nuclear capability, we may have to decide, can we protect South Korea? And if we can, are we willing to lose Los Angeles or Chicago or Washington in order to do that? Essentially the same calculation we had to make about Berlin a generation ago.
So Dr. Hahn, yes, please.
Well, I would agree that the main reason for North Korea to get into the nuclear program was this regime survival. Even before Iraq and Libya happened, or Ukraine for that matter, for them, nuclear weapon was the key to their regime survival. At the same time, for Kim Jong-un, it's slightly different and more than regime survival. And that is, in addition to what David just said about North Korea's position, more of a discretion in dealing with South Korea. For him, he's in a hurry to establish himself as a great leader. And therefore, he would like to be in a position to accomplish something that his father or his grandfather could not have done, and that is to become a direct threat to the United States, to continental United States. And this will make him stand, in his own mind, equal to the United States. It will also make him a great person, a great general in the minds of the North Korean people. And so he will be not only eager to establish himself, but in much of a hurry to do that.
Just one quick point, and we've, I think, rightly focused on the U.S. relationship, but don't forget about the Chinese here, in that, Kim Jong-un is in a very nasty personal fight with Xi Jinping right now, and it's the worst relationship between the two treaty allies it's been in a long, long time, and part of what he's doing is aimed squarely at Beijing as well. I do think that some of these recent tests, while overwhelmingly military in nature to advance the program, also had the side effect to send a clear signal to the Beijing leadership. And you look at the placement of some of these activities, one was right during one of the most recent ones is right during the opening of the BRICS session in Xiamen, China. I think, and not at all coincidental on that, and I'll stop there.
Can I just add
Yeah.
one point to what Mark just said? The Chinese are construing this situation that is cooperating or coordinating with the United States and Japan and South Korea in putting pressure on North Korea as a favor to us, a concession that it is making. As before President Trump goes to Beijing, Beijing has just further reduced or cut off some of the relations they had with North Korea. And that is the wrong way to do it. China should be putting pressure on North Korea. China should be trying to denuclearize North Korea in its own interest, not as a favor to us, not as a concession to us, because North Korean nuclear weapons are in themselves a threat to them. North Korean nuclear weapons are the reason why the US alliance with South Korea, with Japan, is becoming stronger, why the strategic assets are coming around the South Korean neighborhood. And therefore, the Chinese have to change their attitude. Unfortunately, some of us on our side are helping with that kind of thinking by saying that if China helps us, we will do certain favors for China, and that is not a reasonable bargain that we should get into.
You raised a point in this about China, it being in China's interest for a denuclearized peninsula. Some experts and observers have suggested that because North Korea has nuclear weapons, that we should accept that and treat North Korea as if it's a nuclear state and move forward from there. What are the reactions of the panelists to that?
Well, I guess I'll take the first shot. There are two ways of acknowledging a nuclear state. One is to acknowledge it publicly, which we've almost never done outside of the 5 declared states in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? The 5 declared nuclear weapon states. We've left Israel's nuclear capability to be ambiguous. We know that Pakistan has a significant nuclear capability. In fact, we had a secret program a number of years ago to help them make their weapons safe during the Bush administration, but we would never publicly acknowledge them as a nuclear state. We've never publicly acknowledged India as a nuclear state, even though we signed a nuclear accord with them a decade ago that enabled us to once again begin to ship nuclear materials and technology to them, even though they were not signatories to the NPT. So that's on the formal side. On the informal side, of course, we regard Israel, Pakistan, and India as nuclear powers, and we worry about what Pakistan and India might do to each other if something spun out of control. You're going to see a similar fiction, I suspect, with North Korea. And that's if we end up in the realm of acquiescence here. And I would say there's roughly a 50-50 chance, maybe a greater 50-50 chance, that the way we resolve the North Korean nuclear problem is that we learn to live with it. We considered, as a government, bombing China's nuclear test sites in 1963 and 1964. Most of the documents on this have actually since been declassified. You can find them on the CIA website and the State Department website. But it's remarkable because when you read these documents, you could go through and substitute the words North Korea for China in almost every single place and hear the same arguments that we're playing out today about whether we could live with a nuclear state. In China's case, we had. So that's the slightly more than 50% chance. What are the other two options? Well, there's the option that President Trump will decide to take preemptive action, or what his national security advisor referred to as preventive war. They're two very different things. Preemptive is when you actually see an imminent threat. Preventive would be simply striking a country because you don't want to let them get to the final steps. And I think there's a greater chance of that than most Americans actually acknowledge right now, just given the constellation of players. And then the third option is that a miracle happens and that the North Koreans decide they really are going to enter into a negotiation. And if we enter into that negotiation, the US will insist that the outcome has to be a denuclearized Korean peninsula. And I hope we all live long enough to see that day. But the reality would probably be that the best you could negotiate would be a freeze of their current activity. And you have to ask yourself the question, is that good? Well, it certainly keeps the problem from getting worse, but you're freezing them as essentially a pretty well-established nuclear power. And that's very different than the problem that Dr. Hahn confronted in 1994, when they did have no nuclear weapons.
Well, I guess the only thing I would add is, just the theory of the case. Why don't you just agree now? Just acknowledge them as a nuclear power and move forward and try to get into some negotiations. And the answer is there's multiple reasons, but the two main answers that stand out. First, if you acknowledge the North Koreans as a nuclear program, a weapons program, you've got serious non-proliferation concerns in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It's not unlike the Iran problem, where part of the issue was if the Iranians went nuclear and got further along in their program, you had all of these other Gulf states moving in that direction, and you have these nightmare scenarios of no command and control, no real warning times, and the risks of proliferation and/or accident go way up. The second reason is, why would you negotiate with yourself in public before you get back to the table? And it's not clear to me, just as a judgment call, even if you gave this to the North Koreans right now, that it would have any impact on their willingness to come back to the table. They'd probably just pocket it, continue making nuclear and materials and perfecting missile technology. So, that's been, I think, the history, especially under Kim Jong-un. Last point I'll say is that, look, I'm a big fan of negotiations. It's the shortest straight line distance on the map to an outcome here. And that's where we all, I think most of us want to get to quickly. The problem is, how do you get to there? And that's where I think the pressure comes in, and that's where the problem of Kim Jong-un really rears its head in full force.
Terrific. And Dr. Hahn, what do you see the options are going forward?
David Sanger's colleague, Tom Friedman, quoted another expert, Edward Ludwig, who said there are three options: bomb, acquiesce, or negotiate. And Friedman even more simplified it by saying there's no other option than negotiating. It is indeed oversimplification. There are various kinds of options. There are many kinds of bombing, and there are, of course, arguments for and against what kind of bombing you would do, whether it's going to be preventive, preemptive, surgical, or massive bombing. And then, of course, there's the option of what the US government now is saying, that is massive pressure and engagement. And the current US government is saying that it is not strategic patience that Obama administration pursued, but in my view, it is just another name for more of the same, because that's exactly what I think Obama administration pursued. What the current administration is saying is that it will put more of the pressure, and so it is qualitatively not different from the previous administration's policy, in my view. As far as options are concerned, there is the option of relying mainly on China. And this is something that Henry Kissinger, for example, proposes. he says that even bilateral negotiation with North Korea is not useful. Multilateral negotiation is not useful. The only useful dialogue should be with China, what he calls geostrategic dialogue or negotiation with China. I doubt that China has the ability to force or persuade North Korea to give up the nuclear weapons, even if China agrees with the goals and methods of pressing on North Korea. On the other hand, I think it is important that we get as much cooperation from China in the process of applying any other option that we accept. Some people also propose the option, the so-called Iranian option. Mark already mentioned if the United States scuttles the Iranian deal, then the option becomes really irrelevant. But there are so many differences between Iran and North Korea. Iran was only in the early stage of working on nuclear weapons. Iran had commodity to sell, much more connected with the international economy. It had more pluralism within the leadership than there is in North Korea, and so on. Probably a semblance of middle class as well. And therefore, we have to take the Iranian model or option with a grain of salt. But that's one option we should also consider. In between, even as I said, in using force, between show of force and actually using force, there are all kinds of grades and kinds, and we have to seriously consider. The important thing is that the countries which are directly involved, in this case, the United States, South Korea, and Japan, will have to be in locksteps and in very, very close coordination.
I know we want to get to questions, but one just other quick point. Why would he negotiate? I think that's an open question. And there is one theory of the case, that some journalists put forward and experts that I think it's worth mentioning here just quickly. It's that he does have a market problem. He has a problem with his economy. Kim Jong-un does right now. And he has it sort of in two prongs, and some defectors have talked about this, some journalists have talked about this. Prong one is that there's some school of thought that he wants to run the economy a lot like his grandfather ran the economy. And that means some sort of benign state influence in the economy. What does he need to do that? He needs hard currency to do that. And he can't do that when sanctions are biting and the hard currency is going to the nuclear missile program. So that's point one. Point two, he's got a market problem. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the 90s, when there was mass famine and the public distribution system broke down, informal markets came in. And they're coming in increasing amounts and numbers in North Korea. And what does that mean? That means state control is decreasing over time. And he probably has to figure out some way to bring these informal markets into and regulate into the structure of the economy, because he can't put them back in the bottle, and he probably knows that. He can't get the state back to where it was, where it can just provide this big public distribution system benefit, because the Soviet Union doesn't exist to give a lot of financial aid, and China isn't willing to do it. So he's got to figure that piece out. So it all means that it doesn't necessarily mean he'll move to negotiation, but it does mean there is at least an argument to be made that he has to make some sort of strategic move in and around the economy that could lead to coming back to the table for negotiations. And last thing I'll say on that, he could easily come back to the table and say, I want a freeze on, I'll agree to a freeze on US military exercises. I want a lot of money from the Chinese and others. I want to be recognized as a nuclear weapons power. And that would be pretty tough, and it would probably divide a lot of the members of the six-party talks.
You know, and I would add to that, it's already divided them. And the Chinese and the Russians have both already proposed freeze-for-freeze motions. The only thing that's kept it from dividing them is that the White House has been against it, and the North Koreans have been against it.
That's right.
But if either one of those changes their view, then that makes a big difference. One other thing, Emma, I just wanted to add briefly, because I know you want to get to questions. There's one other technique here that we have not mentioned, but which was critical to the Iran deal and may or may not prove to be critical to North Korea, and that is sabotage. Harder for members or former members of the US government to discuss, but the US went out on a very concerted effort to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. You all probably read about Stuxnet, which was a program codenamed Olympic Games that was all about trying to slow the Iranians by directing a cyber weapon to blow up their centrifuges. And it was a significant contributor to the Iranian decision to come to the table. In the North Korea case, it's been a lot more difficult. Iran's a fairly open, computing-intensive society, highly networked. North Korea's got fewer IP addresses than you have on one block of this campus, okay? Makes it a lot more difficult target. The US did have a program that President Obama accelerated in 2014 to go after the Musadan missiles, which were a mid-range missile that was being tested. And while we don't know exactly how successful it was, because for any given launch, it's very hard to tell what causes a failure, for a while, the program was failing at a rate of 88%. That's a pretty high rate for a pretty well-known missile that the Russians had built prior to it. Kim Jong-un stopped making that missile in around this time last year. And he has gone on with some new and different missile designs. And so far, he's been pretty successful at most of those launches. We've seen relatively few failures. But it does leave open the question of whether the United States may end up using its newest and most powerful, in some ways, weapon at this kind of thing, using cyber and old-fashioned electronic warfare to try to slow the program again and convince Kim Jong-un that we're not going to let it go forward. The advantage of doing it that way is that you're not as likely to start up a war as you are if you blow something up on the missile pad. But it's chancy, and what works on a Thursday may not work the following Monday. So it gets pretty complex pretty fast.
Terrific. Thanks for getting that in there, David. Let's turn to audience questions. Reminder, the first 3 questions are from students, so please come to the microphone and we'll recognise you.
Hi, I'm Samuel Leiter. I'm a 4th year undergraduate. So my question is, given that we take Kim Jong-un to be rational, that nuclear weapons have only been used defensively, that nuclear blackmail doesn't tend to work if we look at the historical record, why do we care about North Korea having nuclear weapons unless we plan to attack them?
Who'd like to take that?
I guess I'll do it. What I would say is, first, it's not clear that he will adhere to mutually assured destruction. It's not clear that he will adhere to conventional nuclear deterrent policy, and he could obviously launch a weapon. That's of deep concern to us. That's point one. Point two is, because they have never had nuclear weapons, don't have this long history of understanding how deterrence works, the likelihood of accident goes way up, or accidental launch goes way up. Third, you've got proliferation problems. South Koreans, Japan, Taiwan that I mentioned before. Full stop there.
Oh, sorry, Dr. Hung.
Yeah, let me just add that even if Kim Jong-un doesn't use nuclear weapons as such, that will embolden him with his provocations vis-a-vis South Korea, for example. And because they will always say and believe that South Korea cannot respond in a forceful way as long as North Korea has nuclear weapons and South Korea doesn't.
Yeah, and just last on this, remember there's a long history of North Korean provocations against South Korea. Most recently, the sinking of the Cheonan, the shelling of Yeongpyeong-do Island, but goes back many, many decades, including a bombing of a civilian aircraft, attacking civilian leadership of South Korea while in Burma, so on and so forth. So there's a long history of this that is very serious, very dangerous, very deadly, that could spike if and when they get a nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile.
Next question, thanks.
Hi there. Thank you all for coming, first of all. My name is Chris. I'm a grad student here. My question relates to the domestic situation in the United States. I'm particularly interested to hear what all of your thoughts are when it comes to what the United States can credibly commit to as both a threat or as something they're going to commit to at the negotiations table, given the sort of volatility of the domestic political situation. But then also, it's sort of very difficult to have informed discourse, even with a bunch of people who care a lot about this issue, given the fact that it involves, potential nuclear annihilation of Los Angeles, Chicago, Seattle, what have you.
Well, I guess I'll start on the domestic situation. First of all, it's been very hard to track President Trump on these issues, to put it mildly. So I went off with my colleague Maggie Haberman to do 3.5 hours of foreign policy interviews with him last year. And it was in the course of pressing him on his idea that he was willing to pull back on troops from South Korea and Japan that he basically said he was okay with the scenario that Mark just laid out, which was Japan and South Korea getting their own nuclear weapons. He doesn't seem to be okay with that now. He, at various points, has said that he would negotiate with Kim Jong-un. And then when his Secretary of State went to China, I was with him for this trip about a month ago, and said he was trying to open some channels. He tweeted out, "Give it up, Rex. These people only respond to one thing." He did the fire and fury line. Today, he was once again inviting the North Koreans to negotiate, and when asked how this differed from what he said about Rex Tillerson's effort, he didn't answer the question. So if his goal right now is to leave the North Koreans completely confused, I would say he is 100% successful. He's also leaving the people who cover him completely confused on this issue. This gets harder when he gets to China later on, well, tomorrow, our time, because as it was suggested before, he's got to change the Chinese calculus. China does, as Dr. Han suggested, think that they're doing us a favor here. And what the president needs to make the Chinese think is that the status quo as it currently exists, a threatening North Korea, isn't going to remain the status quo. That much as the Chinese might like to have this nice buffer state that separates us and our forces from the Chinese border, that if North Korea continues on this line, the current status quo isn't going to exist. And yet, as you suggested by your question, if you say that enough times and you build yourself into that box, you may have to actually execute on it at some point. And one of the things we know about Donald Trump is that he does not want to appear in any transaction to have come out on the losing side. So you could imagine a situation there where he feels forced to take military action to make good on his word. And that's, I think, what's behind the fear you hear from the South Koreans, and Dr. Han can speak to this much better than I can, that President Trump will talk himself into a corner here.
Yeah.
This is not a direct answer to your question, but your question reminded me of an episode, and that is, I was ambassador here from 2003 until 2005, when President Bush was conducting a very hardline policy toward North Korea. And even then, each time there was a summit meeting with the South Korean president, who was rather progressive at that time, he would always say, President Trump would say, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, from the US point of view, the Iranian nuclear issue is much more serious than the North Korean issue or question." And President Bush said that in an apologetic way, but it was a welcome statement from our president's point of view, because he thought, well, that means the US is not going to bomb North Korea. Well, whatever the case may be, it is, I think, true that at that time, the US could have placed more emphasis, more attention, pay more attention to the North Korean problem, because objectively, the North Korean problem was much more serious than the Iranian problem, which was just beginning with its nuclear weapons. And now, of course, because North Korea seems to have the ability to strike continental United States, the US is becoming all heated up about the issue. Now, the Korean concern is that the US is getting more heated, overly heated on the issue.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Michelle Shim, a second year at the college, and I happen to be born in the year of the Sunshine Policy in Korea. So from my childhood, I remember times when there seemed to be moments perhaps of genuine connection across the DMZ and more sympathetic attitudes towards North Korea. Can such attitudes be dangerous now for the South Korean people, but also in the international community, if there even is any sympathy for North Korea anymore? And how should the South Koreans be reacting? As Dr. Han was saying, they've been exposed to North Korean threats for so long that a lot of them have become numbed. And this really isn't a big jump for them because they've always been threatened by North Korea. So that's one question. Second question is, what can South Korea do, sandwiched between China, Japan, and the US?
Great. I think your question reminds me that, Dr. Han, you were a teenager at the time of the signing of the armistice. And maybe in sort of answering the question about the way North Koreans are viewed, or South Korean sort of South-North relations, you could sort of reflect a little bit on that experience and your thoughts about how the armistice and then the DMZ creation has potentially led to, or what impact that has had on the situation we're in today.
Well, I just wrote in Korean my own memoir where I talk about the armistice agreement, and I was a middle school student of, I think, 11, 12 years old. And because our seniors prompted us, we went out to the streets and opposing the armistice without unification of the country. But when it happened, of course, people are of divided views. So the same person is relieved that the war has ended in some way. On the other hand, it ended in an incomplete way. But I think if genuine survey was taken, I think people would have accepted the armistice. But to the question that she is asking, are you asking if the so-called Sunshine Policy is the right policy or not? Or what is the...
I guess my question was more towards what would be the right kind of attitude to take towards North Korea in the international community, but in South Korea particularly, when they seem much more numbed and almost not as worried about the threat?
Well, I think the person that we have to really observe and study is the current president of South Korea. He certainly comes out of the political camp which supports Sunshine Policy, which is in some ways sympathetic to the North Koreans, if not the North Korean regime. And so he's willing to have dialogue with the North Koreans, help the North Koreans as much as possible. But the circumstances are such. That was before he became president. Once he became the president, he sees how difficult it is and how aggressive North Korea is, how dangerous North Korea is. It's just difficult to carry on or implement what he thought was the desirable policy. And so he is putting a lot of emphasis on strengthening our military capabilities. He is focusing on defense. He's focusing on our alliance with the United States. And so even those people who have been more inclined to supporting 100% of the so-called Sunshine Policy, once they get into a position of responsibility, they find that the situation doesn't allow that.
I guess I would add just quickly, if I were giving advice to the South Korean government, I would say strong deterrence, strong vigilance, but keep checking to see if negotiations, if they'll come back to the table. Keep the door wide open, but also in the interim, be as vigilant as possible.
Terrific. I'm being told we have time for one more question, but why don't we be a bit sneaky and take two, and then the panelists can respond to those questions in their final summation. So.
Chinese thought leaders have been talking about a new kind of relationship between great powers and avoiding the Thucydides trap. But one could say that if Kim Jong-un's ambition is to oust the United States from East Asia and to reunify Korea on his terms, his goal is actually aligned with a Chinese regional hegemony goal. So to avoid that imputation, suppose the United States insisted we do want denuclearization and nothing less than a kind of blockade that would change the regime would accomplish that. How would the United States persuade China to adopt that course of actually changing the regime, and what kind of agreement about a post-Kim Jong-un Korea should be made?
Right. Thanks very much. And final question here.
Thank you. We've all enjoyed the panel's scholarship and commentary. I'm not a student here, but I thoroughly enjoy the law library when I'm playing hooky and not going into the office. Question one, I was interested in the panel's thought in regard the notion that North Korea is a sovereign nation with the inherent right to develop and to test nuclear weapons, just as the West developed, tested, and detonated nuclear weapons in the Pacific, and that the true provocation in that region is the presence of the U.S. fleet and the annual exercises of the Korean Peninsula. And my second question, 20 years later approximately, we're still looking for weapons of mass destruction in Afghanistan and Iraq. The pretense to go to Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin, non-existent. Isn't the decision for North Korea and other similar nations to develop nuclear capability a rational defensive posture?
Right, so I think we've got three questions in there. I'd ask the panelists each in turn to address aspects that they would like and just give any final concluding remarks.
Let's see here. On reunification of the peninsula under his terms, What I would say to that is his big problem, Kim Jong-un's big problem with that is the overwhelming conventional superiority of the South Korean military. And the North Koreans know that. And the North Koreans have pulled back their own conventional forces in recent years because they see the massive conventional capability gap that exists on the peninsula, augmented by 30,000 U.S. troops, high-end capability, another 55,000 U.S. troops in Japan. It's a loser. That's one comment. I would say on, just the point about the U.S. exercises being provocative. Look, we canceled our biggest exercise. It was Team Spirit. It was a huge exercise. General Dunford, our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually participated in it as a first lieutenant and will tell you how realistic, how big. We canceled that. There's a whole laundry list of how many times we offered that to both Kim Jong-un's grandfather and father. It was eventually canceled, and it was subsequently pocketed. It comes down to a fundamental judgment, which is if you took away the exercises and you reduced all these tensions on the peninsula, so-called tensions spun up by the South Koreans and the U.S., would Kim Jong-un come back to the table, or would he keep making missiles and nuclear material? And I would suggest he's going to keep making missiles and nuclear material. His father, I think there was a debate, and that gets back to the question about the Sunshine Policy, trying to make a big strategic move on a regime that seemed interested. But right now, I would just say the conditions are not ripe, and it comes back to the point that I made earlier, which is strong deterrence and vigilance coupled with a clear path to negotiations.
Terrific.
You asked a fascinating question, which is, are any of the North Korean and Chinese interests aligned? And certainly some are, because the Chinese have always decided that they would prefer that buffer than the risking the collapse of the North Korean regime and the chaos that could follow. And they may still have that view. My own view is that the biggest risk we have of conflict in the Korean Peninsula does not come from Kim Jong-un lobbing one at us. He knows that his country would only be around for about 45 minutes after that. I do believe that if we increase the pressure, we're going to see some reaction from him. Probably won't be nuclear, probably will be in the cyber realm. Think of what happened to Sony, think of the other kinds of increasingly aggressive cyber actions they've taken. But the thing that worries me the most is actually North Korean collapse. Because for a few minutes, we would all sit around and say, wow, this is great. Kim Jong-un finally got what he had coming to him. And then we would realize that we're in a scramble with the Chinese and to some degree with the South Koreans for an unknown number of nuclear weapons. Emma accurately said at the beginning, could be 2030, but it might be 60. You'd never be able to walk into the president and say, sir, we have all of them, because you'd never know how many all of them was, right? And it's that moment when somebody in North Korea believes that the entire regime may be on the verge of collapse, going down the tubes, they're not entirely sure where Kim Jong-un is, that I think you would have the highest risk of a missile being launched at Japan or South Korea, or maybe even us, but more likely Japan and South Korea. So this is one of those cases where you have to be careful what you wish for and manage for it very closely, and try to have that discussion that many US governments have tried to have with the Chinese about planning for that moment. And it's something the Chinese, until now, have not wanted to do.
Thank you. Dr. Han, final word for you.
Well, on the first question, China-North Korean relationship is very complex. There is, I might say love and hate, but not much love, and mostly the other one. And the Chinese, they also certainly have an interest in keeping North Korean regime afloat. But at the same time, they are studying very seriously of the consequences, the interests and the losses of, in case Korea, the Korean Peninsula is reunified under South Korean auspices. And some of us have been actually discussing that issue with Chinese scholars, officials, former officials on that issue. And so if we talk with the Chinese, in addition to the nuclear issue, the discussion should be not how to bring down North Korean regime as such, but what kind of guarantee, what kind of assurance we can give to the Chinese in the aftermath of the unification. And the Chinese does very extensive study of the unification of Germany, for example. What happened to NATO? What happened to the security relationship with the rest of Europe, with the United States, between United Germany and the other countries. On the other question about North Korea's right to have nuclear weapons, if you're talking about legality and principle, North Korea not only was a signatory of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but also it had a very firm agreement with South Korea on non-nuclear country, and no uranium enrichment, no plutonium production, and everything. As far as legality is concerned, North Korea has no defense in going after nuclear weapons. And of course, there was the Geneva Agreed framework, which they had to keep. I think it is, you can't say that every country, because it is sovereign, has the right to have nuclear weapons. And that is the reason why the United Nations, the Security Council, has imposed a series of sanctions on the activities of North Korea.
Well, thank you very much. And my apologies it's run over, but I think it's indicative of the richness of the experience and the discussion and the wisdom that we have on this stage. So please join me in thanking the panelists.